The land was quiet, too quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles in at dusk, but the kind that presses against your ears, the kind that feels wrong, as if the ground itself is holding its breath. This land had seen life, footsteps crossing it day after day, laughter drifting through open air, ordinary moments that never asked to be remembered. And yet, beneath that familiar surface, something unspeakable waited. No warning, no struggle anyone heard, just soil layered over silence. And a truth no one was ready to face. Katlyn Harp was not supposed to disappear. She had a life that followed patterns, morning routines, people who expected to hear from her, people who would notice if she didn't answer. So when she stopped responding, when calls went unanswered and messages sat unread, it didn't feel like a delay. It felt like absence, heavy, sudden, alarming. At first there were excuses. There always are. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she stepped away for a while, but those excuses didn't sit right. They never do when something is truly wrong, because instinct speaks before evidence ever does. This is where many true crime stories begin, not with violence, but with silence. Katlyn was known as someone who believed in people. She trusted easily. She saw the best before she saw the danger. Friends described her as warm, present, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke. The kind of person who didn't expect betrayal, especially not from those closest to her. But trust, when misplaced, can become a weapon. Days passed, then more days. Each sunrise brought a new hope, and each sunset carried it away again. Her family lived in a state of waiting that never rested. Phones stayed charged, lights stayed on, sleep came in fragments, if at all. Every vibration of a phone sent a jolt through the chest. Every unfamiliar number felt like it could change everything. Posters appeared. Her name printed in bold letters, her face frozen in a photograph taken before anyone knew it would become a plea. Strangers scanned those posters in grocery stores and gas stations, reading the details, wondering briefly, then moving on. But for her family, time had stopped. Hope is a strange thing. It hurts, but it refuses to leave. Rumors began to surface. Someone thought they saw her. Someone heard something. Every lead was chased, no matter how thin. Because when the alternative is accepting loss, even the smallest possibility feels worth everything. Still, the land said nothing. No one imagined the truth wasn't far away. It wasn't hidden in some distant city. It wasn't buried deep in the wilderness or carried across state lines. It was close, uncomfortably close, right where life had gone on as usual, on land that should have meant safety. There is a particular cruelty in crimes that happen at home, in places meant to protect. When danger doesn't break in from the outside, but lives inside the walls, shares meals, learns routines. When betrayal doesn't announce itself with force, but with familiarity. Behind closed doors, things are rarely what they seem. Relationships have fractures that don't show from the outside, quiet arguments, lingering resentment, secrets that grow heavier the longer they're hidden. Sometimes those secrets involve other people. Sometimes they involve choices that can't be undone. And sometimes they end in disappearance. As investigators would later learn, Katlyn's life was more complicated than it appeared. There were tensions, there were truths that had not been spoken aloud, and there were people who knew more than they admitted. But in these early days, none of that was clear yet. There was only the waiting, the kind of waiting that eats at you. That makes you replay conversations over and over, searching for meaning where there was none before. The kind that fills silence with questions no one wants to ask. What if she didn't leave on her own? What if she could? The idea crept in slowly, unwelcome and terrifying. Because once you let yourself consider it, you can't push it away again. The possibility that someone had hurt her, that someone had decided her life was disposable. And worse still, what if that someone was already known? The land remained untouched. Grass still grew. Days still passed. To anyone driving by, nothing looked out of place. And that was the most chilling part of all. Evil does not always leave marks. Sometimes it blends in perfectly. This chapter is not about how Katlyn died, it's about how she lived in a world where danger didn't look dangerous. It's about how quickly normal life can fracture, how a routine morning can become the last one, how trust can turn into vulnerability without warning. Because before the police tape, before the questions, before accusations and evidence and truth clawing its way to the surface, there was only silence, and a question that sat heavy in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. What if the danger had never left? What if it was still there, walking freely, untouched by suspicion? What if the ground beneath their feet already knew the answer? The land was quiet, but it wouldn't stay that way forever. The cracks didn't appear all at once, they spread slowly, quietly. At first, everything looked normal, too normal. Investigators began where they always do, by retracing Katlyn's final days, not the dramatic moments, the ordinary ones. Conversations that once felt forgettable were now replayed again and again. Text messages were read word by word, punctuation suddenly important. Pauses between replies became questions, deleted calls became shadows. What had once seemed meaningless now felt heavy. Something didn't fit. The timeline refused to stay still. One account placed Katlyn here, another placed her somewhere else. Times overlapped when they shouldn't have. Hours went missing, and with every retelling the story shifted just enough to be noticed. People closest to Katlyn wanted to help, or at least they said they did. They answered questions, then answered them again. But the answers never landed the same way twice. A detail added here, one removed there, small changes, subtle changes, the kind people make when they're trying to remember or trying not to. Investigators noticed this wasn't confusion, this was friction, because when someone truly doesn't know what happened, their story stays messy but consistent. When someone does know, the story bends under pressure, and this pressure was building. It became clear that Katlyn had not simply walked away from her life. There were no packed bags, no final messages, no signs of planning. Her routines had stopped mid-motion, as if interrupted. People don't vanish like that unless something or someone forces them to. This wasn't a disappearance, it was a disruption. Police shifted their focus. They stopped asking only where Katlyn might have gone and started asking who had last seen her, who had been alone with her, who knew the quiet details of her life. The patterns, the habits, the times she'd be vulnerable. Domestic cases are always the hardest. Not because they lack evidence, but because the evidence hides behind familiarity, behind relationships, behind doors that close every night, and sometimes behind love that isn't what it claims to be. Investigators learned that not everything in Katlyn's life was as calm as it appeared. There were tensions, emotional fractures, whispers of betrayal, relationships complicated by secrets, trust stretched thin by choices no one wanted to admit out loud. Affairs don't always end relationships. Sometimes they ignite them, and sometimes they destroy everything around them. As pressure mounted, the land itself became part of the investigation. Properties connected to Katlyn were examined, yards walked slowly, steps measured, ordinary ground took on an unsettling weight. Investigators don't just look, they feel. They notice when grass grows unevenly, when soil looks recently disturbed, when the earth tells a story without saying a word. One patch didn't look right, nothing dramatic. No obvious sign of violence, just a subtle difference, a place that didn't match the rest. The kind of thing most people would walk past without a second thought, but investigators stopped. Because experience teaches you this, the ground remembers. While law enforcement worked quietly, Katlyn's family lived inside a nightmare that refused to end. They existed in the space between hope and terror. Every knock at the door felt like it might collapse their world. Every phone call made their hearts race before they even answered. They wanted answers, they feared them, Grief is heavy, but uncertainty is unbearable. Not knowing where your loved one is, not knowing if they're cold or scared or alone, that kind of pain doesn't scream, it hums constantly. The community began to notice too. People talked, at first in private, then out loud. Rumors moved faster than facts. Every new detail added fuel. Every unanswered question sharpened suspicion. And with attention came pressure, the kind that makes secrets uncomfortable. Investigators felt it, the family felt it, the town felt it, and someone else felt it most of all. Someone who knew exactly where Katlyn was. As scrutiny increased, behaviors changed. Nervous energy replaced confidence. Small mistakes slipped through. The mask began to crack, because carrying a secret like that is exhausting. It weighs on the body, on the mind, on every word spoken under watchful eyes. The closer authorities moved toward the truth, the more obvious it became that the truth was fighting back. People can hide lies for a while, but they can't hide them forever. The land waited, silent, patient. It had been quiet for weeks, but silence, like guilt, has a breaking point. And as investigators prepared to dig deeper, both figuratively and literally, the tension reached a place where it could no longer hold. Because the earth doesn't keep secrets out of loyalty, it keeps them until it's disturbed. And that moment was coming. The ground was about to speak. The first shovel broke the surface and everything changed. No sirens, no speeches, just metal cutting into earth that had stayed quiet for far too long. There was no dramatic build-up, no warning that this was the moment. Investigators had learned not to announce hope out loud. They worked in silence, measured and controlled, knowing that once the ground was disturbed, there would be no turning back. The soil resisted at first, then it gave way. What they found beneath confirmed what everyone had been afraid to admit. The search was over. Katlyn Harp was no longer missing. She had not wandered off. She had not started a new life somewhere else. She had been buried. The air changed instantly. Even seasoned investigators felt it. That heavy shift when a case stops being a question and becomes a certainty. When hope dies quietly without permission, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The truth was there. For Katlyn's family, the news traveled like a shockwave. It didn't arrive gently, it didn't soften itself. It hit all at once, stealing breath, collapsing strength, forcing a kind of pain no one is prepared for. The kind that doesn't scream at first, it just sits, crushing, permanent. This was not an accident, this was not confusion or bad luck or fate. This was a deliberate act. Someone had made a choice, a decision measured in seconds that would echo for a lifetime. Someone had believed they could erase a person by covering her with dirt, that they could return to daily life while the truth slept underground. But secrets don't stay buried forever. As the reality settled in, the investigation snapped into focus with brutal clarity. The timeline that once felt tangled now made sense. The gaps closed, the inconsistencies aligned. Statements that had shifted now stood exposed, stripped of excuses. The lies collapsed under their own weight. Investigators began reconstructing Katlyn's final hours, where she went, who she spoke to, who was with her when the last moments unfolded. Every step was mapped, every movement traced, and the picture that emerged was devastating. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was calculated, contained, hidden. To bury someone on familiar land is not just an attempt to hide a body. It is an act of confidence, of arrogance, a belief that the ground will protect you, that no one will look too closely at what feels ordinary. It is the ultimate betrayal of trust. Domestic crimes often carry this signature. Violence that grows behind closed doors, choices made in silence, rage, jealousy, fear, or exposure colliding in a moment that can never be undone. Affairs that complicate loyalties, secrets that threaten to surface, truths that feel too dangerous to survive. Katlyn knew something or represented something, and someone decided she could not walk away. Once the body was discovered, the case transformed. The search phase ended. The accountability phase began. Evidence was no longer hypothetical. It was physical, tangible, impossible to deny. Forensics spoke when people wouldn't. The earth told its story layer by layer. Time was measured not in days but in decay. The land had preserved the truth long enough for it to be heard. Every detail mattered now. Each piece of evidence carried weight not just legally but morally. Because this was no longer about what might have happened, it was about what did happen and who was responsible. As investigators presented their findings, the silence broke. Katlyn's voice returned not through sound but through facts, through timelines, through proof that refused to be ignored. Her life, once reduced to a question mark, reclaimed its shape. She had been real, she had been present, and she had been taken. The community reeled. People who had followed the case from a distance now felt complicit in the shock. The realization that something so horrific could happen in familiar spaces unsettled everyone. Trust felt thinner, safety felt fragile, because if this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. The person responsible could no longer hide behind uncertainty. The ground had spoken. The lies had nowhere left to go. What had been whispered was now undeniable. This was the point of no return. There would be no rewriting this ending. No explanation that could make it make sense, no justification that could restore what was lost. But still the hardest part remained. Justice does not arrive with the discovery of truth. It arrives later, slowly, through processes that cannot heal grief but can name it. And even then the questions linger. Why did it have to happen this way? What moment changed everything? Could it have been stopped? Those questions would echo long after the investigation moved forward. Because once the earth gives up its secret, the truth doesn't bring peace. It brings reality, and reality demands reckoning. Katlyn's story was no longer buried, but its weight was just beginning to settle. Justice is not the same as closure. It never has been, and it never will be. The courtroom can deliver answers, but it cannot deliver peace. A verdict can name the guilty, but it cannot bring a voice back. When the legal process finally moved forward, when the facts were laid bare and responsibility was assigned, the world kept turning. But Katlyn Harp did not return with it. For her family, time split in two, before and after. Birthdays came and went without candles. Holidays passed with empty chairs. Phone numbers remained saved even though they would never ring again. Loss did not arrive all at once, it stayed. It settled into everyday life, into quiet mornings and sleepless nights, into moments when memory rushed in without warning. No sentence could undo that, but accountability still mattered. Because accountability is how society draws a line and says this was wrong. This should never have happened. This life mattered. Without it, silence wins. And silence is what allowed this crime to exist in the first place. Katlyn's case forced a hard truth into the open. Evil does not always arrive screaming. It does not always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it looks like someone you know, someone trusted, someone who shared meals, shared space, shared secrets. Sometimes it looks normal. That is what makes domestic crimes so terrifying. They grow quietly. They hide behind routine, behind smiles, behind explanations that almost make sense until they don't, affairs that blur loyalty, emotions left unspoken, resentment allowed to rot instead of being confronted. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself, it waits and then it acts. The land where Katlyn was buried became more than evidence, it became a symbol, a reminder that truth can be covered but never erased. That secrets do not disappear just because they are hidden. They change the ground, they leave marks, they demand to be uncovered. That patch of earth would never be just land again. People who followed the case felt it too, a shift, a discomfort that lingered long after the headlines faded. It forced a question many didn't want to ask themselves. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Katlyn's story is not only about her death, it is about trust given freely and trust broken completely. It is about warning signs that felt too small to name until it was too late. about moments of silence that should have been interrupted. It is about how easy it is to look away, and how dangerous that can be, because when someone disappears, it is not an inconvenience, it is an emergency. When stories don't align, that discomfort is not paranoia, it is instinct. And when something feels wrong, it is often because it is. This case became a lesson written in pain, one that no family should ever have to teach the world. If someone goes quiet suddenly, pay attention. If behavior changes without explanation, ask questions. If secrets begin to surface, do not bury them deeper. Responsibility belongs to all of us to notice, to speak, to act before silence becomes permanent. The truth about Katlyn Harp did not come easily. It had to be fought for, dug out, carried into the light piece by piece. And even then, it did not heal the damage, it only named it. Justice closed a chapter in court, but grief did not close its grip on the people left behind. Some nights are still too quiet, some mornings still begin with disbelief. Healing does not follow a schedule, and closure does not arrive just because a case is solved. And yet Katlyn's name endures, because remembering her is an act of defiance against what was done to her, because telling her story refuses to let her be reduced to evidence, because her life deserves to be more than a footnote in a crime. The land gave up its secret, the truth rose, but the weight of it remains. And maybe that weight is meant to stay with us, as a warning, as a responsibility, as a reminder that darkness thrives where silence is allowed to settle. The truth always rises. The question is whether we are willing to face it before it is buried too deep to save anyone else.